Chapter 14. Tegan, Atkins and Norris listened in silence as the doctor finished the recitation from his notes. Tegan and Atkins had filled Norris in on the background on the way to the TARDIS library. He had taken a little convincing that the Doctor, Tegan and Atkins had travelled in time, but the apparently impossible inner dimensions of the TARDIS and the events he had already witnessed that night left him little room for scepticism. Now they sat round the reading table, the Doctor's notes and papers strewn over its surface, and looked at each other. Nobody seemed to want to be the first to venture an opinion. Eventually Tegan spoke. "Why Nyssa, Doctor?" Her voice was uncharacteristically quiet. "And how did they know where to find her?" The Doctor shook his head. "I don't really know. There's obviously a temporal paradox, probably caused by the interference of the lodestone sarcophagus with the TARDIS's relative dimensional stabilizer." His voice gathered an enthusiasm which belied the gravity of the subject matter. "My guess would be that it plucked us out of the vortex and somehow signalled the mind of Nephthys, the intelligent, reasoning side of her mind. She, in turn, influenced the unpleasant Egyptian gentleman we met at the British Museum, and he sent Nyssa back in time to the point where they were expecting her." "But why Nyssa? Why not you or me, or anyone?" The Doctor flipped through his notebook. "It mentions how the receptacle had to be without blemish. I suspect they were trying to recreate the exact state of the canopic jar, which probably excluded external influence and energy, rather like the zero room here in the TARDIS did. Nyssa would have been ideal." He set down the notebook and leaned forward across the table, chin resting on his hands and eyes alive with thought. "Think of it, Tegan. Nyssa is from the Trakan Union. For all her life, the Keeper and the Source ruled such that there was no concept even of evil. What more pure mind could one hope to find anywhere in the universe? Nyssa must have been ideal for their purposes." Atkins coughed politely. Doctor, I wonder if you could clarify one small point for us." "Just the one?" asked Norris quietly. The Doctor nodded. "If I can." "You said that Horus created the receptacle, the original canopic jar, in order to imprison the mind of Nephthys. Part of the mind, yes. But then you said just now that it was Nephthys that brought the TARDIS to Victorian London, and who in effect found Nyssa in order to replace the jar." Tegan could see what Atkins was saying. "That's a point," she said. "Why would Nephthys provide another prison?" The Doctor looked at them across the table. "Horus was long gone, him and the rest of the Osirans," he said. "The jar was cracked, and I think just a tiny fragment of Nephthys' mind was able to leak out. Enough to take control of a servant or agent, probably someone already with plans in line with her own objectives. Also, enough to detect the TARDIS and draw it to the British Museum." "But why bother?" Norris asked. "Why go out and find your own new prison?" The Doctor steepled his fingers. "Say you were in the same position. God forbid. No, just consider for a moment. The High Priests know the jar is cracked, and they will certainly find a replacement of some sort. Yes?" Norris agreed. "Wouldn't you rather, if you could manage it," the Doctor asked quietly, "find that replacement for them?" Norris gave a short laugh. "Not much of a choice, though, is it? Unless—" He stopped short, the smile freezing on his face. "Unless?" prompted the Doctor. But it was Atkins who answered. "Unless you provide a prison you know you can escape from," he said. "Exactly. But how?" Tegan asked. The Doctor shrugged. "I wish I knew. The Egyptians and Prior are acting on impulses seeded thousands of years ago and passed on. The power seems to be focused through the relics, which our Egyptian chum is now collecting. Somehow they seem imbued with some of the instinctive power of Nephthys. I can only assume that she is working on some incredibly long-term master plan. He leaned back in the chair, swivelling it slightly to and fro. But I do know one thing. What's that? The doctor's face was grim, his voice equally grave. Somehow we've been caught up in the plan. Or perhaps we were always part of it. When Nyssa awakens, which will be very soon now, Nephthys, the most dangerous and evil of the Asirans, will be born again. For a long while nobody spoke. Then the doctor stood up. "Come along," he said, grinning widely. "We're nearly there." And he started towards the library door. Norris caught up with him ahead of the others. "Doctor," he said, "I don't think I follow everything you said." The doctor smiled. "I don't think any of us do," he said, as he held the door and waved them through into the corridor outside. "But," Norris went on, "how does Vanessa Pryor fit into all this?" "Ah." The doctor stuck his hands in his pockets and looked down at the floor as he walked. "I really don't know," he confessed. "You called her Nessa, Nephthys. You can be sure she fits in somewhere." From the distance came the melodic chime of the TARDIS landing. "We're here," the doctor said, increasing his pace along the corridor. "Perhaps her father can enlighten us as to Miss Pryor's role in all this." When they reached the console room, the doctor immediately opened the scanner. It showed the basement tomb room of Kenilworth House. The sarcophagus containing Nissa's body was in the foreground, the staircase behind. "It's funny," said Tegan. "Just an hour ago I was desperate for Nissa to wake up, and now I almost hope she never does." The doctor clapped her on the shoulder. "Brave heart, Tegan," he said. "We'll think of something." He closed the scanner again and reached for the door lever. "If only we knew where the local power was being channeled from." "Local power?" Atkins asked. "Couldn't it just be sent from Egypt?" "Oh, indeed it could, and undoubtedly is." The doors swung heavily open. "But there has to be a reception point. Even the mummies have a tiny pyramid on each of their lower backs to collect and focus the power they need." The doctor stuck his hat on his head and made for the door. "Pyramid power," Norris said, his eyes wide. "So that's what he was doing." The doctor stopped in mid-stride. "Is there something you feel you want to share with us?" he asked politely, leaning forward and pushing his hat back on his head. Norris looked at him, his face blank. "I was the architect for the rebuilding of this house," he said. "We know," Tegan reminded him. "I drew up the plans and supervised the work. But the plans were pretty much dictated by the owner. They reflected what Pryor wanted. I just drew up the design, however bizarre." Tegan frowned. "Bizarre?" Norris nodded. "I thought so then. Now I'm not so sure. The whole of the top section of this house. You must have noticed the slope of the upper walls, the heightened elevation of the roof." The doctor said nothing. Tegan and Atkins looked from Norris to each other and back again. "I thought I was drunk," Tegan murmured. "Doctor," Norris said, "the whole of the upper part of this house, the internal structure, is a perfect pyramid." The doctor walked slowly back to the console. He rested his hand on the door lever for a moment, staring down at the control. Then he looked up. "I think I'd better make a couple of extra stops before I speak to Mr. Pryor again," he said. "Where are we off to now?" The doctor shook his head. "Not we, Tegan. Just me. I'd like you, Atkins and Norris to find Pryor. He probably doesn't realise we're on to him. Try to find out all you can about what's happening here." "And what will you be doing?" Atkins asked. "Don't worry about me. I'll be back here before the fun starts." "You think this will be fun?" Tegan asked. "Oh, yes," the doctor said, as he ushered them out of the TARDIS and into the basement. "I'm just not sure who for, that's all." Prior was in the drawing room. He was sitting alone by the empty grate, a facsimile of the notes from one of Carter's expeditions open on the coffee table beside him. He was leaning forward, chin resting on the sphinx handle of his walking stick. He was staring into the fireplace, as if transfixed by the dancing yellow of the fire that was not there. Perhaps he was daydreaming, or perhaps he was watching the flames raging through his house as the fire took hold. Tegan, Atkins and Norris stood just inside the door, watching him. He seemed unaware of their presence, even when Atkins coughed quietly and asked if they might join him. As they exchanged worried looks and sidled into the room, Prior turned slightly, his watery eyes staring past them. Then his eyes seemed to focus, and he coughed suddenly and shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, as he looked from Norris to Tegan. "Really, I am." "Sorry?" Norris stood directly in front of Prior and bent forward so that he was looking directly into Prior's face. "What do you mean, Aubrey? What's happening? What's going on here?" Prior did not react. The answer, instead, came from the other side of the room. "That, Mr. Norris, I think we shall all discover before too long." Sadan Rasul stepped forward. He had been standing by the window looking out into the night. Now he faced them across the drawing room, a semi-automatic pistol in his hand. "You are back from Cornwall rather earlier than I had anticipated," he said as they backed away from the gun. "No doubt the doctor gave you a lift. Where is he?" He addressed the question to Tegan. "I don't know, and I wouldn't tell you if I did." Rasul raised an eyebrow. "In that case, I won't bother to ask you again. But your tacit confirmation that he brought you here is sufficient for the present." He laughed. "The present. What a strange term to those of us who exist outside time," he said. "Though I confess the doctor's particular relationship with time does give him several advantages. For example, I had to drive back from Cornwall like the very devil." His round, hairless face cracked into a broken smile. "But perhaps that is my prerogative." Atkins pushed his way in front of Tegan and Norris. "May I ask what you intend, sir?" "Indeed you may, though I am sorry to have to decline to answer. For the moment." He nodded to Prior, who stood and walked stiffly towards the door. "In the meantime, however, I would invite you to join me in the basement for what will be the culmination of my long life's work, and of Mr. Prior's rather shorter existence." He waved the pistol to encourage them on their way. "I would suggest that you all accept my kind invitation, without too much fuss." Nobody moved. Prior stood stiffly at the door, his eyes again glazed over. Tegan, Norris and Atkins held their ground. Rasul smiled, his face cracked across with satisfaction, as from behind him a loud swell of discordant music rose from the organ and echoed round the room. "I have had so long," Rasul said quietly as the organ music faded, "so very long to form an appreciation of the motifs and eccentricities of human nature." "Oh yes," said Tegan, "and what's it taught you?" "That a short, sharp shock, to coin a rather modern phrase, is an especially effective incentive. Now, you are all expendable to a greater or lesser degree, and I do not intend you to disobey me again." He raised the pistol and sighted along it. The report was like a fist slammed into an open palm. It echoed and ricocheted round the room like the organ chord before it. Norris stood for a second, open-mouthed in amazement. Then his eyes rolled upwards, as if trying to see the hole in his forehead from which the blood poured down his face. The viscous liquid dripped off his chin and splashed to the wooden floor. Norris tottered, seemed almost to slip on the sticky mess at his feet, and collapsed. They descended to the basement in silence. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, Tegan went over to the sarcophagus. Atkins joined her at the dais, looking down at the body of Nissa. It was completely wrapped in the bandages, silent and still. But Tegan knew that before long her lungs would heave in a great breath of air, and she would begin to waken. As Tegan watched, she was almost sure that there was a slight movement, a rise and fall in the chest. Almost. "The doctor, I see, has returned." Rasul was between the dais and the door. Pryor stood quietly beside him as Rasul levelled the pistol at the group by the coffin. Tegan looked round and saw in the corner of the room the solid shape of the TARDIS. "Indeed I have." The doctor stepped out from behind one of the heavy curtains and advanced on Rasul, who swung round slightly to cover him too with his gun. "I've been having a bit of a poke around," the doctor said undeterred, "and I think you should stop this nonsense right now." Rasul gave a short laugh. "Oh, doctor," he said, "ever the optimist." "I try my best." The doctor looked round at the others. "Where's Norris?" he asked quietly. "Mr. Norris will not be joining us, I fear," Rasul replied. Immediately, the doctor's face darkened and his eyes narrowed. "Rasul, I promise you I'll prevent—" Rasul's short laugh cut him off. "I have watched from afar your pathetic attempts to prevent the inevitable, Doctor. Nissa told me that you would interfere." "Did she indeed?" "But I had no idea that your interference would be quite so entertaining." He motioned for the doctor to join the others on the dais. "So kind of you to provide one of your own companions as a receptacle. So kind of you to have the entrance to the Black Pyramid excavated so I could recover the relics of power. So kind of you to return now to witness the final becoming." The doctor stood his ground. "And you are?" he asked levelly. "I am Sadan Rasul. I am the High Priest of the Tomb of Nephthys and Guardian of the Sacred Spirit." He gave a short bow, keeping his eyes on the doctor the whole time. The gun did not falter in his firm grasp. The doctor nodded thoughtfully and wandered slowly towards the dais. He paused on the way to tap his finger on the top of a specimen table and to examine the necklaces laid out on it. A small spotlight set into the ceiling cast a brilliant glow across the polished wooden surface. "High Priest and Guardian," he said quietly. "I imagine that you were charged with protecting and preserving the prison of Nephthys." He looked up suddenly, blue eyes piercingly bright in the spotlight. "Since you seem to be working to ensure that Nephthys is resurrected, I would suggest you have betrayed the trust and duty of your post. Wouldn't you agree?" Rasul shook his head slowly. "How little you understand, Doctor." "I understand this," the doctor said grimly. "If Nephthys is born again, there is not a power in the universe which could stand against her. Her brother told me that all life would perish under his rule, that where he trod he left only dust and darkness. Nephthys is worse. What has happened to your loyalty to your task? What has happened to your loyalty to your fellow humans, to all forms of life?" "You know me even less than you know what is happening here," Rasul told him. "My loyalty is to one person only. I betrayed her once, but now I will see that justice is done, that the wrong is righted." The gun shook slightly in his hand as if his grip were too tight, too tense. "One person, Doctor, is worth everything." The doctor shook his head sadly. "No, Rasul, you don't know what you're doing. One person, whoever it is very insignificant. When all life is at stake, what is the life of one person? Make the choice, Rasul," he begged. "Give up the notion that you can effect a rebirth. It just won't work." Rasul laughed again, his eyes gleaming. "So you would sacrifice a single life to prevent the rebirth of Nephthys, Doctor? Is that what you are saying?" The doctor nodded. "Tell that to Nissa," Rasul said quietly. "That is the choice you had 100 years ago, and you chose the life of your friend." The doctor looked up at the dais. Tegan caught his eyes for a second, then he looked away. "No," he said. "No, that's different. I didn't know what I was doing." "And you say I do not?" Rasul's lip curled. "You are right about one thing, though, Doctor. As I said before, you don't know. You will never understand." Tegan could hear the doctor breathing deeply as he looked down at the floor, hands in pockets. Then suddenly he darted across the room to the nearest wall. Rasul's pistol tracked his movements. Rasul's smile remained fixed, as if he were amused by the doctor's antics. "I understand this," the doctor said, and grabbed a handful of the heavy velvet curtain. He heaved, face creased up with the strain, and the curtain collapsed, bringing the ceiling rail with it as it came away from the fixings and crashed to the floor. Behind it, the painted facsimile of the wall of the tomb wobbled slightly. The doctor walked quickly round the other walls, pulling down the curtains as he passed until they were all piled on the floor. The room seemed brighter without the dark curtains, and the sound echoed slightly where before it had been dulled and quiet. "A copy of the outer tomb of Nephthys," the doctor said, as he dusted his hands on his sweater. "A perfect copy, I grant you, but still a copy." Rasul nodded. "And a copy will never allow the psionic energy we need to be focused and controlled as the original would. Is that your conceit, Doctor?" "That was what I thought at first," the doctor conceded. "But now I know better." "Then enlighten us, please." The doctor seemed to consider. Then, unexpectedly, he grinned. "If you'll let Mr. Atkins lend me a hand, I will." Rasul nodded to the group on the dais. Tegan waited by the casket, while Atkins joined the doctor by the wall. "What do you require us to do, Doctor?" asked Atkins. The doctor tapped the plasterboard wall behind him. "Help me break this down, would you?" The sound of the shot echoed round the room for what seemed like minutes. Tegan instinctively ducked. She had seen Rasul raise the gun, sight along it, and then fire directly at the doctor, a slow-motion replay of the way he had shot Norris. But although it seemed to take forever to happen, she had no time to call a warning. The bullet ripped into the wall, punching a fist-sized hole beside the doctor's head. Chips of plaster lodged in the doctor's hair and peppered his clothing. Rasul lowered the pistol. "Just to get you started," he said quietly, "since we don't have very much time." "Thank you." The doctor sounded calm, but Tegan guessed his hearts were beating a little faster. It took only a few minutes to rip down the thin wall. Atkins managed to get his hand through the hole made by Rasul's bullet and pulled out handfuls of plasterboard. Before long, the hole was large enough for the two of them to tear out pieces, and when the first board was gone, they were able to get behind and push down the other plasterboards which formed the skin wall of the room. "Help them clear the rest of the walls," Rasul said to Tegan. She joined the doctor and helped him pull down the next sections. Pryor was already working on one of the other walls, while Atkins completed the last. When they had finished, the basement was full of dust. It settled slowly, drifting like mist and catching at the back of Tegan's throat. Through the dust, Tegan could see the actual basement walls which had been concealed by the plasterboard. She looked round and could tell from Atkins's expression that he was as puzzled as she was. He was peering at the closest wall. "What is it?" he asked. "Some sort of inscription?" "In a way," the doctor said, "we are standing inside the tomb of Nephthys, brought stone by stone from Egypt over 20 years ago and reconstructed here." "How right you are, Doctor," Rasul said. "And your next logical deduction must therefore be—" The doctor stared at Rasul for a moment. Then he nodded and crossed to another wall, opposite the main entrance. Most of the dust had settled, though the doctor's feet kicked up new showers and clouds as he walked. Tegan watched as he approached a familiar symbol within the inscription. The cartouche. The name of Nephthys. He paused for a moment, then pressed the centre of the open square, and the wall swung back to reveal the secret chamber behind. "Shall we?" Rasul walked up behind the doctor and pushed him lightly in the small of the back with his gun. The doctor stepped through the open wall, and Rasul waited for everyone else to follow. The room was exactly as Tegan remembered it, except that the two Shabti figures from the corridor were standing either side of the door as they entered, as if on guard. She stared into the face of one as she passed. It was the image of Vanessa. Rasul entered the room behind them, standing just inside the doorway. One hand was in his jacket pocket, the other held the gun steady. The doctor had crossed immediately to the mummy. "An impressive setup," he said. "Why not release Prior's mind so he can tell us about it?" "Really, Doctor?" Rasul sounded disappointed. "Prior's mind has not been his own for many years, and I'm afraid all vestiges of self-control are now extinguished." The doctor shook his head sadly. "You won't succeed. Even with all this, it won't work." "Oh?" "You obviously realize that the configuration of the tomb is key. The psionic focus must be exact if you're to harness the raw power of the stars of Orion. So you've altered the structure of this house to construct a pyramid, and you've rebuilt the whole of the tomb area in the basement. You may even have got the measurements exactly right and have the top of the pyramid the right height above the floor of this chamber." "Oh, we have, Doctor. Trust me." I do. "But have you considered the alignment of the ventilation shafts within the pyramid? They're actually transport corridors for the power before it is focused by the Sphinx. The position of the Sphinx is, I grant you, not so important, but you have to have the power here to focus in the first place." He grinned and leaned on the edge of the sarcophagus. "Do you really think I am totally naive?" Rasul's voice was a snarl of contempt. "The skylights are exactly positioned to allow the energy to pass down the shafts and focus." "And the stars?" Tegan said. "The doctor says the constellations shift over time. And anyway, we're not in Egypt." Rasul threw back his head and laughed. "To miss something so elementary," he said. "Incredible." "Ah," the doctor pointed a victorious finger at Rasul. "So you have missed something." Rasul shook his head. "No, Doctor. You have. If the constellations move, or rather the Earth's position relative to them, then so must we." The doctor's eyes narrowed, and Tegan could almost hear the calculations going on inside his head. "We're talking over 20,000 years until the alignment is back to the original position. By now the offset must be thousands of miles. At a rough guess—" He broke off and his eyes widened. "What is it, Doctor?" Atkins asked. "The doctor has just worked out, at last," Rasul said, "that the alignment of Orion's belt relative to the Egypt of the Assyrians exactly matches that over London today." He smiled. "Or rather, tonight." "But you still need a receptacle." The doctor punched the air with his fist, a sharp jabbing motion to punctuate his point. "You need a living form for Nephthys to inhabit. This one's dead." He gestured at the mummy he was standing beside. The bandages were stained and crumpled. The form sagged, barely resembling a human form any more than a rag doll. "I know," Rasul said, his voice suddenly low and forced between clenched teeth. "Believe me, Doctor, I know." The doctor frowned. "And you need the life force already to have taken hold. You need it to be somehow intrinsic to the recipient." Tegan felt her stomach tighten as she realised what he was saying. "Doctor, what about Nissa?" "It's all right, Tegan. The reason she was ideal as a constraining container for the reasoning, calculating evil of Nephthys is exactly the reason she can never become Nephthys. Every atom and dendrite of her would rebel against the evil that is so alien to her as soon as it gained any sort of consciousness. It would never work." Rasool said nothing. "So where does that leave us?" Atkins asked. "Well, it leaves us with this sad, unfortunate." The doctor drew his hand along the mummified form in the coffin. He shook his head and patted the bandaged arm. A strip of cloth fell free as he touched it. It slipped over the edge of the arm, revealing a dusty grey area beneath. The doctor stared at it for a second, then suddenly whipped out his spectacles and leaned closer. "Someone's been taking tissue samples," he said. His voice was a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. "Who on earth would want to do that?" He looked over the tops of his glasses at Rasool. But the answer came from Tegan as the facts clicked into place in her brain. "Prior," she said quietly, and Rasool smiled in confirmation. "Prior?" Atkins asked. "But why?" "Norris told us that Prior wasn't always an archaeologist. I found a room the other night, before he got this bee in his bonnet about Egyptology. I think he was into genetics." "Oh, no," the doctor said quietly. Then he sat down cross-legged on the floor. "The study of Egyptian genetics is fascinating," Rasool said, "as is the application of computerized axial tomography to mummified remains." "Of course," the doctor slapped the floor between his legs. "I should have realised. A CAT scanner. He scanned the Nephthys mummy." Tegan looked from the doctor to Rasool and back again. "A cat what?" she asked. The doctor looked up at her. His face was slack and resigned. "CAT scanning is quite simple, really," he said. "You X-ray the mummy from all angles along the central axis, and the computer builds a three-dimensional picture from the X-rays. People have been doing it since the 1970s. You can see all sorts of interesting things. Bones, jewellery, even internal organs, wherever they now happen to be packaged. And all without unwrapping the mummy." He looked over at Rasool. "You can also unleash an awful lot of trapped psionic power. Like the mind of Nephthys." "Nephthys is already free?" Tegan was horrified. "No. Horus would have planned for that. Some power would leak into the immediate area. That's probably how Rasool here got control of Prior. The rest would be stored in some sort of backup container." "Like Nissa?" "Same principle. It means this mummy is worthless, though." "You are very astute, Doctor." Rasool stepped towards them. "The backup containers, for there are in fact 4 of them, now house the instinctive side of Nephthys' mind, but the mummy in here has other uses." "Of course, the relics. They acted as focus points for the power anyway, so they were ideal to pick up the released evil and loathing." Rasool nodded. "They must be present when the sleeper awakes, then her mind will be whole, and she will live again." "Aren't you forgetting something?" Atkins asked. "The doctor said that Nissa could not become Nephthys. You still need a host for her mind." "Doctor," Rasool asked, "do you understand yet?" The doctor's voice was scarcely audible. "The skin samples." "Exactly. Prior took the samples 22 years ago. Using his expertise in genetics, he rehydrated the tissue." 22 years? Tegan said. "That would be a year before Vanessa was born." Rasool nodded. "Yes." His voice was a hiss of triumph. "That is what Pryor used the reconstituted tissue for. Vanessa Pryor is a clone of Nephthys." He raised his arms above his head, as if in supplication to the gods. And Atkins launched himself across the room, cannoning into Rasul's heavy frame and sending him flying through the open doorway. The doctor was on his feet in a flash and ran to the connecting room. Tegan raced after him, but it was already over. Rasul was shaking his head and picking himself up from the stone floor. Atkins stood in front of him, holding Rasul's pistol. "Well done, Atkins." The doctor strode across to join him. Atkins offered him the gun, but the doctor shook his head. No, you keep it. Now, I suggest we continue our discussion somewhere a little more comfortable. There's still a couple of things to clear up, I think. Atkins and the doctor crossed to the main door, Rasul following them warily. Pryor was still standing motionless in the other chamber, so Tegan brought up the rear. Atkins stopped at the bottom of the staircase. "After you," he said to Rasul. Rasul smiled. "I think not," he said calmly. The heavy bandaged hand of the Osiran service robot lashed out from the shadows of the lower staircase. It caught Atkins full on the chest, hurling him across the room. He crashed into a display case, sending it smashing to the ground. The headdress within cracked on the stone floor, beads and precious stones ricocheting along the room. The massive mummy descended the last few steps into the chamber and started to lumber towards Atkins. Behind it, another mummy stepped down into the basement. Atkins recovered himself quickly, rolling onto his back and climbing to his feet. The mummy lurched towards him, seeming to increase its speed as it approached. Atkins raised the pistol and fired in one movement. The crack of the shot echoed off the walls and the bullet tore into the mummy's extended chest. It did not even slow down. The slight trail of smoke rising lazily from a tiny hole was the only sign that the robot had been hit. Atkins aimed the gun again, but the mummy was already upon him. It smashed his arm aside, sending the gun skidding across the floor. The mummy raised its right arm high above its head, ready to crash it down on Atkins's skull. "No!" The voice rang across the chamber like a chord from a giant organ. Vanessa stood in the doorway at the foot of the stairs, a mummy standing either side of her. She was still wearing her nightgown, together with the ring and the bracelet. Beside her, one mummy held the cobra, the other the statue of Anubis. Rasul had already recovered his gun before any of the others realized what was happening. "You see," he said, his eyes gleaming and his voice full of eager anticipation. "Already the instinct and impulse of Nephthys is taking hold. She knows not to kill him yet, although she has not thought through the reasoning that he may be useful, perhaps as a hostage to ensure the doctor's cooperation." He bowed to his goddess. "Soon you will be whole again. Soon you will be as you were before Horus ripped your mind apart. And in there, too, somewhere, will be the woman you were before Nephthys joined her mind with yours." The two mummies beside Vanessa lumbered forward and positioned the relics on the low shelf behind the dais on which the sarcophagus rested. Then they swung round and lurched their way back to Vanessa. As Rasul watched them, Atkins eased his way round the motionless mummy that had attacked him. It was still standing with its arm raised, ready to strike. As he passed it, the huge figure seemed to relax, its arm lowered, and it turned to face Vanessa. Atkins joined the doctor and Tegan in the middle of the room. "Sorry, Doctor," he said. "So what happens now?" Tegan asked the doctor. Her voice was trembling. "Is Vanessa already gone?" "Not quite. At least, I don't think so." Rasul had heard the exchange. "The presence of the relics and of Nissa when she wakes will complete the cycle. Nephthys will be reborn, complete and anew. The relics without Nissa are already enough to possess the clone with the spirit of Nephthys. Her instinct and intuition are keyed to the DNA pattern of the original host. He paused before the final word, as if trying to think of an alternative. And that's what you're after, isn't it? The doctor stepped forward and stared Rasul straight in the face. It's not Nephthys that really interests you. It's the woman she was before Horus forced Nephthys's mind into her body. Rasul said nothing. He returned the doctor's stare impassively. The doctor continued, And you'll destroy another human being for that. Clone or not, Vanessa is a living human with her own personality. You should use the past tense when you speak of Vanessa, Rasul said in a low voice. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Tegan shouted at him. What about Vanessa and the people who love her? She stepped forward, but the doctor placed a hand on her shoulder to hold her back. What about her life? What about Norris? Didn't he have a right to live? What about her father? Her father? Rasul stabbed the pistol towards Tegan. Then he stopped mid-sentence, stepped back, and regained control of himself. Yes, he said. I think we can now dispense with the services of her father. He almost spat the final word with contempt. Then he turned to Vanessa. Don't you agree? Tegan heard the scuffing footsteps from the other room before she saw Pryor shuffle into the main chamber. His eyes were still glassy and unseeing as he approached them. Then he blinked, and immediately they focused, and he looked round himself in surprise. Vanessa? He seemed to latch on to the person he knew best. Oh, thank goodness you're safe. He went over to her, looking in bewilderment at the mummies standing beside her. Vanessa reached out, the back of her hand stroking down his cheek, to his neck. Then she gripped him tightly with both hands, squeezing his windpipe, choking off the coughed gasps that might have been words. Pryor sank to his knees, smoke rising from his daughter's hands as she throttled him. A sickly sweet smell drifted across the room, and Pryor collapsed to the floor. His eyes were glassy and unfocused again. There was silence for a while. In the doorway, Vanessa stood flanked by the two mummies. Pryor's smoking corpse lay in front of them. Rasul stood beside the other mummy, pistol in hand. The doctor stared open-mouthed at Rasul. Atkins and Tegan looked in horrified fascination at Pryor's body. It's time to make the final moves, the doctor said suddenly in a loud voice. Everyone looked at him, including Vanessa. He shrugged. Someone had to say something. From behind them came a faint rustling sound, almost like a breeze through the trees in a forest. The doctor ran to the dais, Tegan close behind. Rasul joined them as they looked down at the bandaged form inside the casket. It was moving slightly, the chest rising and falling, the wrappings on the lower arms creasing and uncreasing, as if the hands were clenching into fists. A faint sigh came from beneath the strips of cloth covering the face. "Oh no," Tegan said huskily. "She's waking up." Ancient Egypt, circa 5000 BC. She was still alive, but Rasul did nothing. He watched as they dragged the girl's sagging body towards the tomb. He followed, taking his designated place as the last of the relics were carried after her. The ring of Bastet borne on a velvet cushion, the snake statue of Net Gerank, the scarab bracelet, the figure of Anubis, god of the rituals of death. Rasul followed, holding the hourglass before him like the talisman it was. And at his back, he could hear the devourer of the dead snapping in frustration as she was cheated of her victim. The girl was still alive as they removed the dress. She could stand alone now, unmoving, apart from her eyes. She was still alive as Anubis directed the priests to smear her naked body with bitumen. She was still alive as they started to smother the bandages round her. And Rasul did nothing. As the wrappings reached her face, she screamed again, head back and mouth wide, as if to remind them she still had her tongue. A single word, screamed in terror, anger, and accusation. A single word hurled at Rasul as he stood before her, and did nothing. The next twist of cloth cut off her voice, bit deep into her mouth, and gagged her. She was still alive as the bandages covered her forehead, leaving a thin slot through which Rasul could see her eyes widen. She was watching him, locked onto him, and he could see her pupils dilate, could almost feel her terror. The opening of the mouth. Her scream had been like a pouring in of energy. His muscles tightened, and his whole body tensed. She screamed a single word. "Father!"